Chapter 2 The Land Stealer: How Andrew Jackson Shaped the Modern Democratic Party. It was dark before we finished killing them. Andrew Jackson on his massacre at Horseshoe Bend. In January 2015, a group of Haitians surrounded the New York offices of the Clinton Foundation. They chanted slogans accusing Bill and Hillary Clinton of having robbed them of billions of dollars. 2 months later, the Haitians were at it again, accusing the Clintons of duplicity, malfeasance, and theft. And in May 2015, they were back, this time outside New York's Cipriani, where Bill Clinton received an award and collected a $500,000 check for his foundation. "Clinton, where's the money?" the Haitian signs read. "In whose pockets?" said Daoud Andre of the Commission Against Dictatorship. "We are telling the world of the crimes that Bill and Hillary Clinton are responsible for in Haiti." Haitians like Andre may sound a bit strident, but he and the protesters had good reason to be disgruntled. They had suffered a heavy blow from Mother Nature, and now it appeared that they were being battered again, this time by the Clintons. Their story goes back to 2010, when a massive 7.0 earthquake devastated the island, killing more than 200,000 people, leveling 100,000 homes, and leaving 1.5 million people destitute. The devastating effect of the earthquake on a very poor nation provoked worldwide concern and inspired an outpouring of aid money intended to help rebuild Haiti. Countries around the world, as well as private and philanthropic groups like the Red Cross and the Salvation Army, provided some $10.5 billion in aid, with $3.9 billion of it coming from the United States. Haitians like Andre, however, noticed that very little of this aid money actually got to poor people in Haiti. Some projects championed by the Clintons, like the building of industrial parks and posh hotels, cost a great deal of money and offered scarce benefits to the truly needy. Port-au-Prince was supposed to be rebuilt. It was never rebuilt. Projects aimed at creating jobs proved to be bitter disappointments. Haitian unemployment remained high, largely undented by the funds that were supposed to pour into the country. Famine and illness continued to devastate the island nation. The Haitians were initially sympathetic to the Clintons. One may say they believed in the message of hope and change. With his customary overstatement, Bill told the media, "Wouldn't it be great if they became the first wireless nation in the world? They could. I'm telling you, they really could." I don't blame the Haitians for falling for it. Bill is one of the world's greatest storytellers. He has fooled people far more sophisticated than the poor Haitians. Over time, however, the Haitians wised up. Whatever their initial expectations, many saw that much of the aid money seems never to have reached its destination. Rather, it disappeared along the way. Where did it go? It did not escape the attention of the Haitians that Bill Clinton was the designated UN representative for aid to Haiti. Following the earthquake, Bill Clinton had, with media fanfare, established the Haiti Reconstruction Fund. Meanwhile, his wife Hillary was the United States Secretary of State. She was in charge of U.S. aid allocated to Haiti. Together, the Clintons were the two most powerful people who controlled the flow of funds to Haiti from around the world. The Haitian protesters noticed an interesting pattern involving the Clintons and the designation of how aid funds were used. They observed that a number of companies that received contracts in Haiti happened to be entities that made large donations to the Clinton Foundation. The Haitian contracts appeared less tailored to the needs of Haiti than to the needs of the companies that were performing the services. In some, Haitian deals appeared to be a quid pro quo for filling the coffers of the Clintons. For example, the Clinton Foundation selected Clayton Homes, a construction company owned by Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway, to build temporary shelters in Haiti. Buffett is an active member of the Clinton Global Initiative, who has donated generously to the Clintons as well as the Clinton Foundation. The contract was supposed to be given through the normal United Nations bidding process, with the deal going to the lowest bidder who met the project's standards. UN officials said, however, that the contract was never competitively bid. Clayton offered to build hurricane-proof trailers, but what they actually delivered turned out to be a disaster. The trailers were structurally unsafe, with high levels of formaldehyde and insulation coming out of the walls. There were problems with mold and fumes. The stifling heat inside made Haitians sick, and many of them abandoned the trailers because they were ill-constructed and unusable. The Clintons also funneled $10 million in federal loans to a firm called Innovita, headed by Clinton donor Claudio Osorio. Osorio had loaded its board with Clinton cronies, including longtime Clinton ally General Wesley Clark, Hillary's 2008 finance director Jonathan Mance, and Democratic fundraiser Chris Corge, who has helped raise millions for the Clintons. Normally, the loan approval process takes months or even years, but in this case, a government official wrote, "Former President Bill Clinton is personally in contact with the company to organize its logistical and support needs. And as Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton has made available State Department resources to assist with logistical arrangements." Innovita had not even provided an independently audited financial report that is normally a requirement for such applications. This requirement, however, was waived. On the basis of the Clinton connection, Innovita's application was fast-tracked and approved in 2 weeks. The company, however, defaulted on the loan and never built any houses. An investigation revealed that Osorio had diverted company funds to pay for his Miami Beach mansion, his Maserati, and his Colorado ski chalet. He pleaded guilty to wire fraud and money laundering in 2013 and is currently serving a 12-year prison term on fraud charges related to the loan. Several Clinton cronies showed up with Bill to a 2011 housing expo that cost more than $2 million to stage. Bill Clinton said it would be a model for the construction of thousands of homes in Haiti. In reality, no homes have been built. A few dozen model units were constructed, but even they have not been sold. Rather, they are now abandoned and have been taken over by squatters. The schools they never built. The Clintons claim to have built schools in Haiti, but the New York Times discovered that when it comes to the Clintons, built is a term with a very loose interpretation. For example, the newspaper located a school featured in the Clinton Foundation annual report as built through a Clinton Global Initiative commitment to action. In reality, the Clinton Foundation's sole direct contribution to the school was a grant for an Earth Day celebration and tree-building activity. U.S. aid contracts to remove debris in Port-au-Prince went to a Washington-based company named CHF International. The company's CEO, David Weiss, a campaign contributor to Hillary in 2008, was Deputy U.S. Trade Representative for North American Affairs during the Clinton administration. The corporate secretary of the board, Lori Fitzpagato, served in a number of posts in the Clinton administration, including Assistant Secretary of Commerce. U.S. aid contracts also went to consulting firms like New York-based Dahlberg Global Development Advisors, which received a $1.5 million contract to identify relocation sites for Haitians. This company is an active participant and financial supporter of the Clinton Global Initiative. A later review by USAID's Inspector General found that Dahlberg did a terrible job naming uninhabitable mountains with steep ravines as possible sites for Haitian rebuilding. Foreign governments and foreign companies got Haitian deals in exchange for bankrolling the Clinton Foundation. The Clinton Foundation lists the Brazilian construction firm OAS and the Inter-American Development Bank, IDB, as donors that have given between $1 billion and $5 billion. The IDB receives funding from the State Department, and some of this funding was diverted to OAS for Haitian road building contracts. Yet an IDB auditor, Mariela Antiga, complained that the contracts were padded with excessive costs to build roads no one needed. Antigua also alleged that IDB funds were going to a construction project on private land owned by former Haitian President René Préval, a Clinton buddy, and several of his cronies. For her efforts to expose corruption, Antigua was promptly instructed by the IDB to pack her bags and leave Haiti. In 2011, the Clinton Foundation brokered a deal with Digicel, a cell phone service provider seeking to gain access to the Haitian market. The Clintons arranged to have Digicel receive millions in U.S. taxpayer money to provide mobile phones. The USAID Food for Peace program, which the State Department administered through Hillary aide Cheryl Mills, distributed Digicel phones free to Haitians. Digicel didn't just make money off the U.S. taxpayer, it also made money off the Haitians. When Haitians used the phones, either to make calls or transfer money, they paid Digicel for the service. Haitians using Digicel's phones also became automatically enrolled in Digicel's mobile program. By 2012, Digicel had taken over 3/4 of the cell phone market in Haiti. Digicel is owned by Dennis O'Brien, a close friend of the Clintons. O'Brien secured 3 speaking engagements in his native Ireland that paid $200,000 apiece. These engagements occurred right at the time that Digicel was making its deal with the U.S. State Department. O'Brien has also donated lavishly to the Clinton Foundation, giving between $1 million and $5 million sometime in 2010 to 2011. Coincidentally, the United States government paid Digicel $45 million to open a hotel in Port-au-Prince. Now, perhaps it could be argued that Haitians could use a high-priced hotel to attract foreign investors and provide jobs for locals. Thus far, however, this particular hotel seems to employ only a few dozen locals, which hardly justifies the sizable investment that went into building it. Moreover, there are virtually no foreign investors. The rooms are mostly unoccupied. The ones that are taken seem mainly for the benefit of Digicel's visiting teams. In addition, the Clintons got their cronies to build Caracol Industrial Park, a 600-acre garment factory that was supposed to make clothes for export to the United States and create, according to Bill Clinton, 100,000 new jobs in Haiti. The project was funded by the U.S. government and cost hundreds of millions in taxpayer money, the largest single allocation of U.S. relief aid. Yet Caracol has proven a massive failure. First, the industrial park was built on farmland, and the farmers had to be moved off their property. Many of them feel they were pushed out and inadequately compensated. Some of them lost their livelihoods. Second, Caracol was supposed to include 25,000 homes for Haitian employees. In the end, the GAO reports that only around 6,000 homes were built. Third, Caracol has created 5,000 jobs, less than 10% of the jobs promised. Fourth, Caracol is exporting very few products and most of the facility is abandoned. People stand outside every day looking for work, but there is no work to be had as Haiti's unemployment rate hovers around 40%. The Clintons say Caracol can still be salvaged, but former Haitian Prime Minister Jean Bellerive says, "I believe the momentum to attract people there in a massive way is past. Today, it has failed." Still, Bellerive's standard of success may not be the same one used by the Clintons. After all, the companies that built Caracol with U.S. taxpayer money have done fine, even if poor Haitians have seen few of the benefits. Then there is the strange and somehow predictable involvement of Hillary Clinton's brother, Hugh Rodham. Rodham put in an application for $22 million from the Clinton Foundation to build homes on 10,000 acres of land that he said a guy in Haiti had donated to him. "I deal through the Clinton Foundation," Rodham told the New York Times. "I hound my brother-in-law because it's his fund that we're going to get our money from." Rodham said he expected to net $1 million personally on the deal. Unfortunately, his application didn't go through. Rodham had better luck, however, on a second Haitian deal. He mysteriously found himself on the advisory board of a U.S. mining company called VCS. This by itself is odd, because Rodham's resume lists no mining experience. Rather, Rodham is a former private detective and prison guard. The mining company, however, seems to have recognized Rodham's value. They brought him on board in October 2013 to help secure a valuable gold mining permit in Haiti. Rodham was promised a finder's fee if he could land the contract. Sure enough, he did. For the first time in 50 years, Haiti awarded 2 new gold mining permits, and one of them went to the company that had hired Hillary's brother. The deal provoked outrage in the Haitian Senate. Neither Bill Clinton nor the brother of Hillary Clinton are individuals who share the interest of the Haitian people, said Haitian mining representative Samuel Nesner. They are part of the elite class who are operating to exploit the Haitian people. Is this too harsh a verdict? I wouldn't go so far as to say the Clintons don't care about Haiti, yet it seems clear that Haitian welfare is not their priority. Their priority is, well, themselves. The Clintons seem to believe in Haitian reconstruction and Haitian investment as long as these projects match their own private economic interests. They have steered the rebuilding of Haiti in a way that provides maximum benefit to themselves. No wonder the Clintons refused to meet with the Haitian protesters. Each time the protesters showed up, the Clintons were nowhere to be seen. They have never directly addressed the Haitians' claims. Strangely enough, they have never been required to do so. The progressive media scarcely covered the Haitian protest. Somehow, the idea of Haitian black people calling out the Clintons as aid money thieves did not appeal to the grand poobahs at CBS News, the New York Times, and NPR. For most Democrats, the topic is both touchy and distasteful. It's one thing to rob from the rich, but quite another to rob from the poorest of the poor. Some of the Democratic primary support for Bernie Sanders was undoubtedly due to Democrats' distaste over the financial shenanigans of the Clintons. Probably these Democrats considered the Clintons to be unduly grasping and opportunistic, an embarrassment to the great traditions of the Democratic Party. The elusive founder. But what are the great traditions of the Democratic Party? Is the behavior of the Clintons unique, or is it part of a pattern that can be traced through Democratic Party history? This question cannot be answered without understanding what this party is, where it came from. Oddly enough, the origins of the Democratic Party are shrouded in myth. Who is the actual founder of the party that we know today as the Democrats? We all know that Abraham Lincoln is the founder of the Republican Party. Democrats sometimes attempt to claim Lincoln. Obama took a train journey from Illinois to Washington, D.C. to be inaugurated president in 2009, just as Lincoln had nearly a century and a half earlier. Obama took his oath of office on the Bible that Lincoln used at his first inauguration. These symbolic appropriations of Lincoln are commonplace in politics. At the same time, they are deeply misleading. Let's just say that Obama is no Lincoln. Lincoln was a founder of the Republican Party and the first Republican president. His values and beliefs were radically opposed to Obama's. If Lincoln were alive to see today's Democrats, he would likely recognize them to be the same type of dirty, rotten scoundrels that he encountered among Democrats in his own day. More about this in the next chapter. But if Lincoln was a founder of the Republican Party, who started the Democratic Party? Here we get a range of confusing answers. According to the television network PBS, the Democratic Party was formed in 1792 when supporters of Thomas Jefferson began using the name Republicans or Jefferson Republicans to emphasize its anti-aristocratic policies. Now this, on its face, is strange. How can the Democratic Party trace itself back to a man and his followers who called themselves Republicans? Right away, we suspect that progressive PBS is pulling off a scam. Jefferson and his supporters were not the actual founders of the Democratic Party. First, as PBS concedes, Jefferson's party, founded to challenge the Federalist Party, called itself the Republicans. Later, Jefferson's party was called the Democratic-Republican Party. Still, this nomenclature hardly establishes any meaningful kinship with either today's Republican or Democratic parties. Jefferson's party stood for rural agricultural interests against urban commercial interests represented by Hamilton and the Federalists. In a sense, this was the ancient clash between the country and the city. Today's Democrats don't represent rural people against city people. On the contrary, rural America heavily supports the GOP, and the greatest stronghold of Democratic votes is the cities. Jefferson's party also represented states' rights in contrast to the Federalists, who represented the rights of the national government. Once again, today's Democrats have little sympathy for Jefferson on that score. If forced to choose, they would undoubtedly be on the Federalist side of that clash. Today's Democrats want a strong, centralized national government, which was anathema to Jefferson. Now, in one respect, Jefferson does harbinger a proclivity that would later come to be associated with the Democrats, especially with the Clintons. Thomas Jefferson seems to have taken sexual liberties with a young female slave, Sally Hemings, and had several children by her. The issue for Jefferson, as for Bill Clinton, in his notorious sexual misconduct as governor of Arkansas and president of the United States, is not extramarital sex or having an affair. The issue is abuse of power. In 1787, young Sally Hemings was dispatched from Virginia to Paris, where Jefferson was serving as America's foreign minister. According to a blacksmith who worked on Jefferson's plantation, Sally was very handsome and mighty near white, with long straight hair running down her back. While Sally's main duties involved looking after Jefferson's daughter Polly, she was, according to a later account given by her son Madison, also charged with taking care of Mr. Jefferson's chamber and wardrobe. Hemings was only 14 when she arrived in Paris. This was when Jefferson seems to have made his first moves on her. No, this was not a love relationship between consenting adults. It was a reprehensible abuse of position and power. The fact that it was fairly common among slave owners does not make it less reprehensible. So, while there is no straight line between Jefferson's party and the Democrats, there is a tradition of sex abuse that connects Thomas Jefferson with Bill Clinton. In this respect, it may be worth noting that Clinton's middle name is Jefferson. I did not have sexual relations with that woman. This is Bill Clinton famously lying about what he did. He didn't get away with his lie. Jefferson maintained complete silence about his relationship with Hemings. He almost got away with it. Until the late 1990s, Jefferson's impregnation of Hemings was considered a foul rumor. It was traced to a scandal-mongering journalist named James Callender, who, in 1802, published an allegation in a Richmond newspaper that Jefferson had borne children by a slave concubine. Recent scholarship, however, has established to a high degree of likelihood Jefferson's paternity. In fact, DNA tests conducted in the 1990s show that Jefferson sired 6 children by Hemings. At first, the mainstream community of Jefferson biographers, as well as the foundation that runs Jefferson's family home at Monticello, resisted this evidence. The skeptics said evidence could point to any male in Jefferson's family being responsible for paternity. Accusing fingers were pointed at Jefferson's son. But in 2 important books, historian Annette Gordon Reed has shown that Sally gave birth at times when only Jefferson could be the father. There is further circumstantial evidence that points to Jefferson's paternity. He named Sally's children after people important to him, like Madison. He personally ensured that Hemings received special treatment among the slaves. He freed all her children, and some of them, being light-skinned, lived out their lives as white people. The other slaves on Jefferson's plantation were auctioned off to pay off his debts. Today, historians concede that the oral history of the Hemings family is correct. They can trace their lineage right back to Sally and Thomas Jefferson. Even Monticello, the foundation that administers Jefferson's family home, acknowledges Jefferson's paternity. Whether William Jefferson Clinton sired any children with the various women he abused is not known. What is known is that in December 1997, he got Jennifer Flowers pregnant and gave her $200 in cash to have an abortion. Back to our main point. If Jefferson didn't found the Democratic Party, who did? Another common answer we hear is Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, this is a better answer because FDR was certainly a Democrat, and he inaugurated an important phase in the development of the modern Democratic Party. Even so, was FDR the first Democrat? FDR was elected in 1932, so was there no Democratic Party in the early 20th century or in the 19th century? Of course there was. The Democratic Party actually predated the Republican Party. The first Democrat. The real founder of the modern Democratic Party was Andrew Jackson. Jackson, an orphan from Appalachia, rose from obscurity to become America's most celebrated general and military hero after George Washington. He won the presidency by a landslide in 1828 and an even bigger one in 1832. His protégés dominated the Democratic Party for half a century until the Civil War. During his lifetime, Jackson was immensely popular with ordinary people, earning him the reputation of being the common man's president. One might expect the Democrats, who even today purport to be the party of the common man, to embrace Jackson and acknowledge his paternity of their party. This, however, is not the case. So why do they distance themselves from Jackson? Why do progressives consider him such an embarrassment? Not only do many on the left refuse to acknowledge Jackson's founding role in the Democratic Party, they also want to kick him off the $20 bill where his face currently appears. Progressives want to see him replaced on the currency with the woman who ran the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman. To some degree, the progressive objective seems clear. Jackson, after all, owned some 300 slaves during his lifetime. At one time, he ran a plantation that had 150 slaves. So Jackson's expulsion seems consistent with the general progressive antipathy towards slavery. The same antipathy explains the choice of Tubman, who was a female abolitionist. Moreover, Tubman was a woman. If the Democrats are going to place a woman, Hillary, on the presidential ticket, why not also have a woman, Tubman, on the currency? Even so, the proposal is interesting because Jackson was a Democrat, the founding father of the Democratic Party, while Tubman was a Republican. Admittedly, progressives have no intention of highlighting that fact about Tubman. Indeed, it goes virtually unmentioned in the news reports. The progressive media is not comfortable with a female black abolitionist representing the Republican Party, while a white male slave owner represents the Democratic Party. Yet Jackson was not unique in owning slaves. Jefferson did too. So what makes Jackson especially embarrassing for Democrats? Why are they so eager to disavow an individual from humble origins who rose to such fantastic heights, in the process successfully representing and delivering for the common man? Why don't Democrats cherish this aspect of their party's founder? In this chapter, I will show that Jackson has become persona non grata precisely because of how he delivered for the common man. He did so by stealing land from the native Indians and then making it available for cheap purchase by white people, thus making those people beholden to Jackson and his Democratic Party. Now, it is shameful enough to use military power, political intimidation, and trickery to seize and occupy other people's land. It is even more disgraceful to do so while pretending to be the friends of those you are stealing from, giving them the impression you are helping them. Jackson mastered the art of posing as the ally of Native Americans while robbing them blind. Today's Democrats, in this sense, are heirs of Jackson. They, too, appropriate resources from others and distribute them among Democratic constituencies, trading favors for votes. They, too, pose as the friends of those who they are stealing from, justifying their confiscations as good for the victims and good for the country. Jackson started this racket by seizing Indian land and then using it to make white settlers a bargain they could not refuse. He was, in a sense, a merchant trading in stolen goods. In this respect, he exposes the low, disgraceful origins of democratic success with the common man. No wonder Democrats are eager to bury this record, or at least foist it on someone else. The second, less-known story of Andrew Jackson concerns the way he enriched himself through his land dealings and land stealing. Most historians ignore this story. Arthur Schlesinger's 1945 biography, Age of Jackson, says nothing on the subject. Neither does Sean Willins's 2005 biography, Andrew Jackson. John Meacham's Pulitzer Prize-winning biography, American Lion, published in 2008, continues the progressive conspiracy of silence. Shh. From Jackson to Hillary. The full story, however, is told in Steve Inskeep's recent book, Jacksonland, which I will rely on for my subsequent account. Jackson managed national security affairs in a way that matched his interest in land development, Inskeep notes. He shaped his real estate investments to complement his official duties and performed his official duties in a way that benefited his real estate interests. As Inskeep shows, typically Jackson would set his eye on a large tract of Indian territory. Then, even before chasing the Indians off that territory, Jackson would send surveyors in to assess the land in terms of its real estate value. Jackson would then alert his cronies, and together they would make a bid to purchase that real estate. In this way, Jackson became a Tennessee plantation magnate and one of the largest slave owners in his home state. Jackson was a ruthless con artist who became fabulously wealthy by trading on his political office. Sound familiar? His career illustrates the familiar democratic story of leaders making sure that when there are spoils to be distributed, the lion's share goes to them. Obviously, not all Democrats use their political positions to get rich, but a number of them, from Jackson himself to Lyndon Johnson to Bill Clinton, certainly did. Jackson's true modern counterpart, as you have probably figured out by now, is Hillary Clinton. Their stories are closely parallel. If Hillary started out dead broke, as she claims she did, after her husband's presidency, so did Jackson begin with nothing as an orphan. Neither of them became successful through starting and running a successful business. Rather, they cashed in on their political influence. Just as Jackson made money on land deals stemming from his success as a general, Hillary, too, figured out ways to enrich herself through her government positions, becoming fabulously wealthy in just a few years. It may seem that Hillary succeeded through foreign policy, while Jackson succeeded through domestic policy. Actually, they both succeeded through foreign policy. Let's remember that Jackson was dealing with the Indian tribes who were, as a matter of law, separate nations. Consequently, we may accurately say that the current nominee of the Democratic Party is a worthy successor of its founder. The roots of the Clinton Foundation can be found in the land-stealing policies of Andrew Jackson. Unsurprisingly, it is whitewash time for Democratic historians and pundits. This whitewash takes several forms. First, the Democrats accuse America, not Jackson and his successors, of abusing the Indians. Specifically, they blast the earliest Europeans to arrive on the American continent, and the founders for dispossessing the native Indians. The goal is to treat Jackson as simply a bad white American, instead of a bad Democrat. Second, the Democrats pretend to have no connection with the thievery of Jackson and his fellow Democrats. They might acknowledge that Jackson cleared the Indians out of several states in order to build constituencies of grateful whites who then settled those states. Faced with facts, they may also concede that Jackson enriched himself and his cronies through his land stealing. Even so, today's Democrats profess to be shocked to see their fellow Democrats engaged in such behavior. That was then, they suggest, and this is now. What does this have to do with us today? What does it have to do with Hillary? No resemblance to the current front-runner of the Democratic Party is even suspected. Yet, as we saw with the Clintons in Haiti, the tradition of Jacksonian piracy is alive and well in today's Democratic Party. Bernie Sanders may have the same Jacksonian objectives as Hillary, but only Hillary seems capable of pulling them off. Part of the reason Democrats prefer Hillary over Bernie is that she is a more effective Jacksonian, which is to say, a more ruthless and successful thief. Blaming America. Returning to Jackson, let's examine the progressive narrative that faults the white man in general, rather than this specific one, for dispossessing and oppressing the native Indians. Democrats began their tale of Indian tears with two calumnies, the first aimed at the first Europeans to arrive in America, the second aimed at the American founders. So what about the settlers? The first settlers, famously christened the white man, are accused by progressive Democrats of wiping out large segments of the native population, even to the point of genocide. Genocide, however, implies an intention to exterminate a population. Did Columbus or the early settlers attempt this? They did not. Certainly there were sporadic clashes between the white Europeans and the natives, but there was also a good deal of cooperation between them. The historical record is mixed. How, then, did the natives perish in such large numbers? Reportedly, the native Indian population declined by more than 50% in the first century of exposure to the white man. The reason, historian William McNeill shows, is because the native Indians contracted from the white man diseases to which they had no immunity. This is tragedy on a grand scale, but it's not genocide. In his book Plagues and Peoples, McNeill points out that just over a century earlier the white man himself contracted the bubonic plague and other diseases that wiped out a third of the population of Europe. These diseases came from Asia, and the white man had no immunity to them. No one calls this genocide, because it isn't. What about the founders? Interestingly, we see that white attitudes toward the Indian in the 18th century were largely sympathetic. The founders did not consider Native Americans to be inherently inferior to the white man. Rather, they held that the primitive circumstances of the native were responsible for what was perceived to be his barbaric state. They were confident that education and civilization would raise the typical Indian to the level of the white man. In his Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson praised the intelligence, courage, and integrity of the Indians. They are, he wrote, formed in mind as well as in body on the same model as Homo sapiens europaeus. Jefferson rejected proposals to dispossess the Indians of their land on the pretext that they were savages or barbarians. Rather, Jefferson urged that whites include the Indians in American civilization. He expressed the hope that the Indians, rather than clinging to their old ways, would incorporate with us as citizens of the United States. Indeed, several leading figures of the founding period, such as Patrick Henry, John Marshall, and Thomas Jefferson, proposed intermarriage between whites and Indians as a way to integrate the natives into the American mainstream. What they thought impossible with respect to blacks, political scientist Ralph Lerner writes, was seen as highly desirable with respect to Indians. America's first president, George Washington, respected the Indians. As a military officer defending the Virginia frontier, he considered the Indian tribes he encountered so formidable in warfare that, in his view, only other Indians could defeat them. Whenever possible, he did his best to ally with Indians. As president, Washington was not opposed to trading with Indians or the purchase of Indian land, but he wanted these acquisitions to be secured by treaty, not by conflict. He insisted that white settlements bypass Indian territories, leaving them unmolested. It was a vision, historian Joseph Ellis writes, in which the westward expansion of an American empire coexisted alongside the preservation of the original Americans. As president, Jefferson openly coveted Indian land for settlement by whites moving west, But Jefferson, too, sought to obtain this land through treaty and trade. He said, in effect, that they have land and we have merchandise, and so both sides can benefit from the other. In one of his public messages, Jefferson commanded the wisdom of exchanging what they can spare and what we want for what we can spare and what they want. So, concluded Jefferson, let's make deals with the Indians to buy their land in exchange for food, medicine, clothing, and cash. Jefferson knew, of course, that his administration had the power to seize the land. Treaties can be made, treaties can be broken. But Jefferson was unwilling to do that. His mindset in this respect is not pure. Jefferson, in private correspondence, admitted that Indians were reckless with money, and they had little estimation of the real value of their land. They were susceptible to going into debt, which might then compel them to sell land to settle their obligations. If he was unwilling to openly contravene existing treaties, Jefferson was not above obtaining land by exploiting the ignorancy and profligacy of Native Americans. Bargainer versus thief. Still, Jefferson appears as an angel when we set him beside Andrew Jackson. The difference is one between a hard bargainer and an outright thief. Jefferson was a wheeler-dealer, but he was not a murderer. Jackson seems to have had little aversion to killing Indians, especially when they stood in the way of his acquisitions. Finally, Jefferson didn't enrich himself through his policies. Jackson used them to become one of the wealthiest men in the country. Jackson's net worth when he died is estimated at $100 million in today's dollars. Since Jackson always stole in large quantities, it would be more fitting to have him on the $100 bill than the $20 bill. Jackson must be counted as one of America's richest presidents, almost as rich as the Clintons. Democrats today host an annual Jefferson-Jackson dinner, but if they were doing truth in advertising, they would drop Jefferson and stick with Jackson. In order to understand Jackson's founding shenanigans, it's best to begin with his inauguration day in March 1829. Thanks to the rhapsodic portraits of progressive historians from Arthur Schlesinger to Sean Wilentz, this event has gone down in American history as the People's Day. For Wilentz, the symbolism of the day was Jackson's placing himself on the side of egalitarianism and against privilege. Wilentz argues that therein lies the claim to historical greatness. While previous inaugurations were sober, dignified affairs, this one was pure chaos. People broke down barriers and roamed the White House lawn. They swarmed into the ceremonial rooms of the White House. They soiled the couches and broke china. People were climbing in and out of windows. Things got so out of hand that the newly elected president had to leave and spend the night at the National Hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue. This seems like pure plebeian crassness, and it could never happen today. Today's Democrats may claim to be the party of the people, but this does not extend to having them show up en masse to black-tie events. I cannot see Hillary at her inauguration putting up with random hordes swarming through the Blue Room, the Red Room, and the Oval Office. If you haven't made a big donation to the campaign, you can probably forget about getting your inaugural invitation. But in Jackson's time it was different, and some progressive historians treat his inaugural as a special democratic moment in which Jackson showed himself truly a man of the people. But what was it about Jackson that made the people love him so much and feel comfortable enough to treat his new house as their house? Part of the answer is that Jackson was a frontiersman who had proved himself a military hero. Even though he was barely a teenager, Jackson fought with irregular troops in the Revolutionary War. Later, he led an intrepid band of Tennessee militiamen, together with slaves, free blacks, pirates, and Indians, to victory over the British in the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. These exploits are somewhat ambiguous. As a brash 14-year-old, Jackson was captured by the British before he could do much fighting and contracted smallpox soon afterward. Thus, the notion that he was a hardened veteran in his early teens seems to be a product of hagiography, not history. Jackson surely deserved his reputation for toughness in triumph over the British in New Orleans. In this sense, his nickname Old Hickory seems fully justified. Yet even this New Orleans triumph is vitiated somewhat when we recall that he was, even then, strong-arming his Indian compatriots to part with their land. In a manner that anticipates the intrigues and purges of the Clintons, Jackson seems to have been almost as dangerous to his allies as he was to his enemies. Jackson's personal life, while unexceptional for a frontiersman, was nevertheless below the standard that Americans had previously expected from their foremost citizen. Arriving in Nashville in 1788, Jackson took up with a woman, Rachel Donaldson Roberts. Later it turned out that Roberts was separated from her husband, but due to various complications, the couple had never been legally divorced. When Jackson ran for president in 1824 and again in 1828, his opponents accused him of wife-stealing and bigamy. The accusations were unfair because Jackson did not know about Rachel's divorce complications. Eventually, Rachel got a legal divorce, and she and Jackson were formally married. Still, an aura of controversy surrounded this issue throughout Jackson's presidency. Jackson was also known as a peevish, hot-tempered man who got into fights and provoked fights when there were none to be had. Fights in the Old South could easily escalate into lethal duels. Jackson almost got into a duel with Tennessee Governor John Sevier, a veteran of the American Revolution, in a squabble over who should head the state militia. He dueled over a personal issue with another man, Charles Dickinson, and killed him. Jackson, too, was wounded, taking a bullet in his chest that remained lodged there for the rest of his life. Men of this rough metal are often admired, but rarely loved, so the mystery of Jackson's inaugural popularity remains to be solved. Al Capone, man of the people. I believe we can understand what was going on with Jackson and his inaugural mob if we fast forward about a century and envision a similar scene, this one involving the mafia chieftain Al Capone entering the Chicago baseball stadium. When Capone did this, the crowd would go into a frenetic roar, and people would throw their hats up and yell, "Big Al! Big Al! Big Al!" Capone, of course, was a mobster, so why was the crowd for him? The reason is that he was their mobster. As many in Chicago saw it, Capone was merely feeding their insatiable appetite for liquor, gambling tables, and women. Prostitution and gambling were illegal at the time, as was alcohol. Still, there was a demand for those things, and Capone provided them. Naturally, the people were appreciative. They wanted, and he delivered. He may have gone around the law to do it, but was there any other way to achieve the same result? Clearly not. The reason for Jackson's inaugural popularity was that he was a 19th century Al Capone. The people celebrated in Jackson's White House because he was responsible for them obtaining the land to build their own houses. Jackson became a man of the people by providing them with something they wanted that they could not secure for themselves, namely, the land belonging to the Native Americans. Jackson was the consummate thief, and his people appreciated that quality in him. In this case, Jackson didn't do things exactly the Capone way. He didn't really go around the law. He made the law. He was a law unto himself. That's because he had the troops and the guns to make the Indians do his bidding. Of course, Jackson wasn't getting the Indians off their land simply because he wanted to help poor whites to have their own land. What Jackson also wanted was the votes of those people. He was willing to make land available to them, knowing that this would make them into his lifelong supporters and constituents. To restate Jefferson's formulation, Jackson had something that poor whites wanted, namely land, and they had something he wanted, namely their political support. Jackson thus established the Democratic Party's vote-getting strategy for nearly 2 centuries right up to the present day. rob Peter to pay Paul. In order to win the votes of poor white settlers, Jackson had to prove that he was more ruthless than they were. This was necessary because Jackson had to convince them that he could deliver something that they could not obtain for themselves, namely the possessions of some very powerful and warlike Indian nations. In the early 19th century, the Deep South region of South Tennessee and all the way to Florida was occupied by several tribes: the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, the Cherokee, and the Seminole. Of these, the Creek were known to be the most recalcitrant. Jackson proved his mettle by showing he could mow them down and massacre them into submission, earning his subsequent reputation as an Indian killer. Today we may wince at the title, but it was considered a compliment among Jackson's Democratic supporters. Just as much as his exploits with the British, Jackson's popularity was fired by his actions against the Creeks at Horseshoe Bend. In 1813, a militant band of Creeks called the Red Sticks attacked Fort Mims in the Mississippi Territory and slaughtered several hundred whites. Eyewitnesses who arrived on the scene days later found the victims scalped, including women and children. Today we think of Native Indians as disconsolate, victimized people, but we should not forget that they could be bloodthirsty warriors, and this is how Jackson and many other frontiersmen experienced them. Jackson, by this time the general of the Tennessee militia, issued a proclamation calling for retaliation. Among those who responded were the frontiersman Davy Crockett. Jackson also recruited allies from other Indian tribes, notably the Cherokee leader John Ross, who was descended from Indian and Scots-Irish ancestry. Jackson's militia surprised the Creek attackers and routed them. In Davy Crockett's account, "We shot them like dogs, and then set the house on fire and burned it up with the warriors in it." Jackson's troops then went on a rampage, torching Creek villages and slaughtering villagers. At Horseshoe Bend in the Mississippi Territory, now southern Alabama, they settled into a hill overlooking a Creek camp and aimed their cannon at the Creeks gathered there. While Jackson apologists would later speak of a Battle of Horseshoe Bend, in reality the Creeks there were refugees, not warriors. They were seeking shelter from the crossfire. Jackson's force wiped them out. As he put it in a letter to his wife Rachel, "It was dark before we finished killing them." Jackson estimated that beyond the 557 corpses on land, an additional 300 Indians were buried in their watery grave. Jackson's men cut off the noses of dead Indians as they counted the bodies. Afterward, there were few regrets. One of Jackson's soldiers chuckling that he had killed a boy 5 or 6 years of age for the reason that he would have become an Indian some day. Jackson's Horseshoe Bend massacre could be considered a case of frontiersman excess, but in this case Jackson intended to go too far. He wanted to terrorize the Indian tribes in the region, and he largely succeeded. After Horseshoe Bend, Jackson found the other tribes much more pliant. Remarkably, Jackson, after his victory, demanded land concessions not only from the Creeks, but also from the Indian tribes allied with him. They had little choice but to submit. Altogether, his prize amounted to 22 million acres of saleable real estate in southern Georgia and central Alabama. Those sales, Jackson remarked to one of his cronies, John Coffey, would someday yield him a whole lot of votes. While Jackson had few qualms about using force, he preferred, like his successor Democrats today, to rely on intimidation and deceit if he could thereby get the results he wanted. One might expect that the Choctaw would receive decent treatment from Jackson, given that they fought alongside him in the War of 1812. The Cherokee, headed by John Ross, felt sure Jackson would be their advocate, since Ross and others were part of Jackson's expeditionary campaign against the British and the Creek. Soon, these tribes realized that Jackson was as intent on stealing from them as he was from tribes that he fought against. A pretended friend and ally. Jackson cheated his native Indian allies by pretending to be their friend. He would often write them and refer to himself as their father or their great father. Whenever he proposed a measure that harmed them, he usually insisted, doing his best to imitate Indian language, "Beyond the great river Mississippi, where a part of your nation has gone, your father has provided a country large enough for all of you, and advises you to remove to it." Or on another occasion, "It is for your nation's good, and your father requests you to hear his counsel." Biographer John Meacham accepts this at face value. He speculates that Jackson saw himself in this paternal way because he was orphaned at 15 and never knew his own father. But if Jackson was acting as a parent to the Indians, he was certainly an abusive parent. Contrary to what he said, Jackson wasn't offering any counsel to the Indians. He was offering them a fait accompli. The Indians could either surrender or be crushed. Inskeep Riley notes that Jackson defined his parental duty to natives in a way that matched his desire to clear land for white settlement. John Ross, the Cherokee leader, was a shrewd politician who understood treaties and legal documents. What he could not fathom was the bottomless cunning and trickery of the man he was dealing with. Jackson read the Indian treaties in much the same way that Democrats and progressives today read the U.S. Constitution. They care little about what it says. They interpret it to mean what they want it to mean. Jackson didn't have any judicial authority, but he usually didn't need it. He had troops to enforce his view of the documents, and that was sufficient. Ross did score one big, though temporary, victory over Jackson. In 1814, in the aftermath of Horseshoe Bend, Jackson imposed a treaty on the Indians, both his Creek enemies and his Chickasaw allies, which effectively turned the south bank of the Tennessee River over to the federal government. In this case, Jackson intended the land to benefit someone near and dear to him, namely, himself. Jackson had a whole system worked out for how to benefit personally from federal land acquisitions from the Indians. First, he appointed surveyors at government expense to mark the boundaries of the property, thus establishing its title and availability for sale. Jackson's favorite surveyor was his own business associate, John Coffey. Sometimes, though, he used other agents. In a typical correspondence, one agent in a letter marked "Private" informed Jackson, "My dear General, we have succeeded in acquiring an accurate knowledge of all the sections of good lands to be sold." He drew Jackson's attention to 4 sections of land that would form a most desirable establishment for your old age. Knowing that the presence of surveyors might upset the Indians who still occupied the land, Jackson warned them that if they harmed the surveyor, the U.S. government would attack them and seize their lands. In case they didn't believe him, Jackson recruited mounted gunmen to ensure security from Indians who might attempt to protect their own property. Then, as soon as the federal government put the land on the market, Jackson bid on it. He did exactly that with the Tennessee River bank. Unknown to him, however, Ross and his fellow Cherokees were, during this time in Washington, D.C., making their own claims before the federal government. This was hardly unusual at the time. Chickasaws, Creeks, and Cherokees often made conflicting and overlapping claims to the same land. In 1816, Jackson was ready to take profitable possession of the south bank of the Tennessee when he received a stunning notification from Washington. Basically, the U.S. government had decided that it couldn't, after all, sell that land. It didn't belong to the Creek or the Chickasaw. Rather, it belonged to the Cherokee, John Ross's tribe. Jackson had been improperly laying claim to 2 million acres. Outraged at President Madison, Jackson wrote him a fiery letter insisting the Cherokees never had the least semblance of claim to the land, and accusing the president of wantonly surrendering land that was of incalculable value to the United States. Remarkably, Jackson was accusing Madison of ignoring national security. His argument was that it jeopardized the security interest of the United States to have hostile Indian nations within the geographical landmass of the country where whites lived. I think Jackson was sincere in his patriotism and believed this argument when he made it. Still, it is hard to escape notice that this land was also of immense financial and political value to him personally. Jackson used his political connections to try to reverse the Madison administration's ruling. He stirred up land-seeking whites from his own county to deluge the government with protest letters. This correspondence urged the Madison administration to drive the Indians further west so that white citizens could travel without the risk of being murdered at every wigwam by some drunken savage. Buy low, sell high. Jackson was smarting from his defeat, not merely a humiliation but a blow to his pocketbook, but the Cherokee maneuver would prove the first and last time he was beaten by the Indians. Soon, Jackson convinced the Madison administration to give him the right to negotiate with the Cherokees to buy some of the land in question. Jackson implemented a new, and this time successful, rip-off scheme. Jackson's first step was to bribe the Cherokee chiefs. Each of them received presents from Jackson that ranged from $50 to $100. Jackson also used threats and intimidation against Cherokee holdouts. He and his associate John Coffey warned Cherokee leaders that if they failed to sell their land, then white settlers would take it for nothing. Jackson obviously had no intention of offering military protection to the Cherokee against these white intruders. Jackson's offer to the Cherokee was, "Take my money and leave, and then your safety will be guaranteed." Many Cherokee dejectedly agreed to depart from the lands on which they and their ancestors had lived for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. As soon as this happened, Inskeep reports, Jackson and his friends moved to take advantage. The scale of their gain has rarely, if ever, been calculated. Many real estate records from the era have been lost. But records that survive show that after 1816, the names of Andrew Jackson, his relatives, and his two closest business associates appeared on the titles to more than 45,000 acres of newly opened Alabama land. Most was in the Tennessee Valley. The U.S. government opened a land office in Huntsville, Alabama, to sell the newly acquired land. Jackson was ready, along with his associate John Coffey. While both were already quite wealthy, they needed more money to make the large purchases they coveted. So they went to a wealthy investor named James Jackson, a longtime friend of Coffey and Andrew Jackson, and together the three of them formed a business partnership to purchase or enter lands in the Alabama Territory. Jackson also teamed up separately with his brother-in-law, John Donaldson, who brought a group of Philadelphia investors. While Jackson certainly intended to enrich his relatives and cronies, every one of these deals was structured to provide maximum benefit to Andrew Jackson. Inskeep reports in Jacksonland that in order to camouflage the scale of his investments, Jackson put the land that he bought into other people's names. For instance, he listed 3 tracts of land on the south side of the river in the name of Andrew Jackson Hutchings, an orphaned relative of his wife Rachel. More than 2,200 acres were purchased under the name of William Donaldson, Rachel Jackson's nephew. William Donaldson was also the registered name for the purchaser of 13 town lots in Coldwater, the former Indian village at the bottom of Muscle Shoals. At times, Jackson acted alone. When a large plot came up for auction at Muscle Shoals, Jackson leaped up and offered the minimum bid. There were many other bidders, but recognizing Jackson among their number, no one else raised his hand. Jackson was elated. "This section I bought at $2 per acre," he later wrote, "no person bidding against me, and as soon as I bid, hailed by the unanimous shouts of a numerous and mixed multitude." Jackson declared that he found this gratifying, as it was an approval of my official acts. Old Hand Jackson knew the score. He was the one who created the whole racket, so naturally he expected others to let him have a piece of it. In 1818, Jackson spied a real estate opportunity in Florida. The opportunity was created by marauding Indians conducting raids from Spanish Florida. The Monroe administration sent Jackson to Florida to stop the raids. Jackson declared his purpose to chastise the Indians, which, in his parlance, meant to kill them. Although he had been specifically instructed to deal with the Indians and not occupy Spanish land, Jackson entered West Florida, captured Pensacola, appointed a governor there, and started collecting taxes. Jackson's illicit action caused a stir in Washington, but many ordinary people cheered Jackson. By now, they knew the routine. Jackson takes land, chases off the Indians, and then we get to buy it at fire sale prices. This was the American dream in the version created by the founder of the Democratic Party. The Monroe administration backed down, and once again Jackson found himself in a position to win the allegiance of future voters while amply lining his own pockets. As Inskeep reports, Jackson and his associates were planning their Florida investments even before he invaded. Later, Jackson's critics would say that he took Florida solely for the purpose of his personal real estate speculation. Inskeep argues, and I agree, that this is an exaggeration. Jackson wanted Florida for the United States. He wanted settlers to move there, settlers who may, at some point in the future, be beholden to him. And he wanted to make money out of the whole deal. Jackson dispatched his brother-in-law and business partner John Donaldson to Florida. Donaldson went, carrying a letter of introduction from Jackson. There he found, voila, that many doors were open for him. Jackson and his friends invested heavily in Florida real estate. Later, they sold much of that land at many times the price they paid for it. In other words, they made out like bandits. In 5 separate treaties between 1816 and 1820, Jackson forced the Indians to give up tens of millions of acres in what would eventually become 5 American states. In this respect, Jackson is the true architect of the map of the Deep South. We can respect the single-minded determination with which he created what Inskeep calls Jacksonland, while at the same time deploring the self-serving means that were used to bring it about. The evidence disappears. Jackson's real estate shenanigans became a hot topic in his 1828 presidential campaign. Even earlier, in 1824, his opponents suspected him of profiting from political office, but they were unable to produce convincing evidence. By 1828, however, Jackson's critics had gotten smarter and more determined. Jackson, however, was ready for them. On December 4, 1827, a fire broke out in the building containing Jackson's financial papers. Conveniently, all the original records of his earlier land dealings were destroyed. Jackson professed his innocence, and again no one could prove he was behind the fire. The whole situation, however, bears an uncanny resemblance to Hillary Clinton deleting her emails. Oops, they're gone. And now we will never have full information about why she set up her private email account and what she wanted to keep out of the official State Department email system. Hillary might have thought that she was being original, but Jackson got there first. Just like his 21st century counterpart, Jackson deleted the evidence that his critics might have used to incriminate him. Thanks to his land-stealing schemes, Jackson went from living in a log cabin to running a huge plantation stretching over 1,000 acres. In 1819, he and Rachel moved out of their log house and built a mansion that still stands today, with a spectacular white colonnade front that awed visitors then as it does now. As for the old log cabin, Jackson found another use for it. What good is a plantation if you don't have slaves? Jackson converted his former dwelling into slave quarters. Jackson had been a slave owner since his early days as a young lawyer in Tennessee. His first slave was a woman named Nancy. The record of the sale notes that Andrew Jackson Esquire took ownership of a Negro woman about 18 or 20 years of age. Later, as Jackson grew rich and his real estate multiplied, he bought slaves to work that land. Altogether, Jackson owned some 300 slaves over the course of his life. The most he owned at any one time was 150 slaves. This made him a large slave owner by American standards. By contrast with the South American plantations, American plantations were typically quite small, employing fewer than 20 slaves. Jackson was also a slave trader, a practice disparaged by most slave owners. In one telling incident, Jackson purchased an ad in a local paper offering a bounty for one of his runaway slaves. Jackson offered a $50 reward for the return of the slave, and $10 extra for every 100 lashes any person will give him, to the amount of 300. Eventually, Jackson rode his wealth and popularity all the way to the White House. In 1824, the first time Jackson ran, all the candidates were from a single party, Thomas Jefferson's Democratic-Republican Party. There was at the time no system of primaries to determine who should get the nomination. Although Jackson won the most votes, he was outmaneuvered by an adversary, Henry Clay, who steered the presidency to John Quincy Adams. An indignant Jackson and his supporters formed the Democratic Party, while his opponents coalesced into a rival Whig Party. These were the two parties that dominated American politics for the next few decades, until the Whig Party collapsed and the Republican Party was founded. The Whigs, led by the stalwart Henry Clay, provided modest though largely ineffective resistance to Jackson. Until the founding of the Republican Party, however, there was no party in America strong enough to stop the thieving Democrats. The Jackson Democrats won by an electoral landslide in 1828. A central plank of Jackson's campaign was Indian removal. In defending this policy, Jackson suggested his actions promoted the welfare of the Indians. He spoke of preserving this much-injured race by placing them under government protection, free from the mercenary influence of white men. To listen to Jackson, one might think he was relocating the Indians for their own good. At the same time, speaking to Democratic audiences, Jackson's supporters made their case for Indian removal in terms that didn't shy away from bigotry. Jackson ally Lewis Cass, the governor of Michigan Territory, said of the Indians, "To roam the forests at will, to pursue their game, to attack their enemies, to spend the rest of their lives in listless indolence, and to be ready at all times to die, these are the principal occupations of an Indian." Upon taking office, Jackson instructed his allies in Congress to draw up the Indian Removal Act. The legislation gave Jackson the power to offer land west of the Mississippi to Indian tribes. The Indians were expected to give up their land in the east for new land in the west, and Congress appropriated money to pay for their moving expenses. Theoretically, the Indians were being asked to move by choice, but in reality they were being pushed out. Settlers stood ready to occupy Indian lands, whether the Indians voluntarily gave them up or not. Although there was no Republican Party around at the time to stop Jackson, there were many who opposed Jackson's Indian policy. One of them was Jackson's former ally, Davy Crockett. "Several of my colleagues got around me and told me how well they loved me and that I was ruining myself," Crockett confessed. Jackson's minions threatened that Crockett would suffer politically for his opposition. Even so, Crockett stood firm, condemning Jackson's Indian policy as wicked and unjust and oppression with a vengeance. While most of the Indians got the message and started packing, the Cherokees refused to go. The Cherokee position was that it didn't matter what Congress decided. The Cherokee were a separate nation with their own written constitution. They were protected by a slew of treaties with the United States government going back generations. The Cherokees appealed their cause to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the decision was handed down by Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall. Marshall conceded that European settlers had gained control of much of the United States, and that the right of U.S. citizens to occupy the land of the country was conceded by the world. Still, Marshall said, there was no evidence that the Cherokee Nation had relinquished its right to the lands it still possessed. Congress had expressly affirmed those rights through treaties dating back to 1778. Certainly the Indians, lacking power to enforce their rights, were now under the protection of the United States. Even so, Marshall concluded, with seemingly specific reference to Jackson, Protection does not imply the destruction of the protected. Let him enforce it. How did Jackson respond to Marshall's ruling? He ignored it. John Marshall has made his decisions, he quipped. Now let him enforce it. While historians debate whether Jackson said exactly these words, there is little doubt that these were his sentiments. In any case, Jackson took no steps to carry out the Supreme Court's ruling. He allowed Georgia settlers to force the Cherokees to relocate. This was accomplished by stealing Indian livestock, burning Indian towns, and squatting on Indian land. Jackson's conduct in this respect echoes the Obama administration's refusal to comply with laws and court rulings that Obama finds uncongenial. From the Defense of Marriage Act to welfare reform to Obamacare to immigration, today's progressives seem willing to bend the law to their own purposes. This tradition of democratic lawlessness has its true forefather in Andrew Jackson. The Cherokee continued to protest. The tribe owned a printing press which put out a newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix. Acting on the advice of Jackson's former Attorney General, John Berrien, Jackson's people raided the printing house and destroyed the press, shattering it to pieces and silencing the voice of the Cherokee people. Jackson also had Cherokee leader John Ross arrested. The Jackson administration then opened up an investigation into whether Ross was a genuine Native American. Actually, there was little doubt he was. While Ross had Scottish and Irish blood through his father and grandfather's line, Cherokee society was matrilineal, and Ross had Cherokee blood directly through his mother and grandmother. Ross's great-grandmother was a full-blooded Cherokee. The Cherokee recognized him not merely as one of their own, but as their elected leader. Jackson, however, considered Ross to be a fake Indian. In 1834, Jackson's men organized a plebiscite of the Cherokee and put before them the question of whether Ross was a legitimate Native American and whether he actually represented their interests. To Jackson's chagrin, Ross won 95% of the vote. Jackson tried again the next year, and once again the Cherokee overwhelmingly sided with Ross. By itself, the Jackson ploy was transparent and got nowhere, but it's worth noting because successive generations of Democrats have continued Jackson's practice of trying to discredit non-white opponents by portraying them as inauthentic. Today, when Republicans who are Black, Hispanic, or Native American expose Democratic chicanery, they are routinely denounced, not just by Democrats, but also by their allies in the press, as sellouts and, in the case of African Americans, Uncle Toms. For example, political scientist Manning Marable said of conservative Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, "Ethnically, Thomas has ceased to be an African American." Columnist Carl Rowan of the Washington Post wrote of Black economist Thomas Sowell, "Vidkun Quisling, in his collaboration with the Nazis, surely did not do as much damage as Sowell is doing." And Spike Lee said that Michael Williams, a Black appointee in the Bush administration, was such a traitor to his race that he deserved to be dragged into an alley and beaten with a Louisville slugger. Back to our story. Eventually, the Jackson Democrats found a small faction of Cherokee who were willing, in exchange for bribes, to sign a removal agreement. This was called the Treaty of New Echota. The leaders of this group were the true Uncle Toms. They were not the recognized leaders of the Cherokee, and more than 15,000 Cherokee, led by Ross, signed a petition of protest. Ignoring their pleas, the U.S. government gave the Cherokee 2 years to migrate voluntarily. The deadline of 1838 came and went, and most Cherokee had not moved. The Democrats at this point did not hesitate to use force. Those who refused to move were compelled. The soldiers cleared out one farm at a time, one valley at a time, Inskeep writes. Approaching a house, the troops would surround it so that no one would escape, then order out the occupants with no more than they could carry. Native Indians, unable to travel, were rounded up in internment camps, a policy reminiscent of the Japanese internments that a later Democratic administration would enforce during World War II. Reports differ about how bad conditions in the camps were. What no one disputes is that around 4,000 Indians died from malnourishment and disease. The Trail of Tears has gone down in American history as cruel and infamous. It certainly was, although its actual perpetrator was not America, but rather the Jackson Democrats. The Trail of Tears occurred after Jackson had left the presidency. He was, by this time, back at his plantation, the Hermitage. His hand-picked successor, Martin Van Buren, was president, yet Van Buren was only continuing the policies of his mentor. From a safe distance, Jackson approvingly watched his Democratic Party carry out his handiwork. For Jackson, the Trail of Tears represented the culmination of his lifelong efforts. Far from being a disaster, this ugly chapter in U.S. history was one of the original achievements of the newly formed Democratic Party. Moreover, the way the Jackson Democrats treated the Indians was not an aberration. Rather, it was only the beginning of a long subsequent Democratic Party history of dispossession, cruelty, bigotry, and theft.